Have you ever met someone truly virtuous? Did they inspire you or annoy you? Maybe a little bit of both? Well, today I'd like to tell you a story about a man who was truly virtuous. Someone who was so inspired by morality, justice, and individuality that he became the beloved mentor to leaders of nations. Hi, my name is Gabe Bauer, and this is Top Shelf History, where we combine great stories with great drinks. This is the President's Lawyer. It is the drink I have made for you today based on George Wythe, a political leader and a mentor to the founding fathers of the United States of America. The drink is made with 4 simple ingredients: sherry, Blackberry Brandy, Applejack, and apple bitters. Looking back at George's life, it seems like he was almost destined for greatness. He was born in Chesterfield, Virginia, modern-day Hampton, in 1726. At the age of 3, his father, Thomas, passed away, and he was left with his mother, Margaret. Margaret would raise George and instill him with every virtuous thing that he would end up growing up to be. Herself an educated woman, she taught George both Latin and Greek and instilled in him the scholarly wonder that would guide him throughout the rest of his life and push him towards accomplishing a lot, and I do mean a lot, of incredible achievements. Let's list them off for you. Let me get my little piece of paper here. He was Virginia's foremost classical scholar, the dean of lawyers, a Williamsburg alderman and mayor, the member of the House of Burgesses, a house clerk. He was the colony's attorney general, a delegate of the Continental Congress, speaker of the state assembly, the nation's first college law professor, Virginia's chancellor, and a framer of the federal constitution. And that's not even the best he's known for. If you looked up my dear friend George, you would also find that he was both a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a mentor to future US President Thomas Jefferson. But that's not even the full story. George's ethics were so virtuous that he was described as being spotless and of the purest tint. He was so respected by the Virginia delegation that they had left a spot in their section of the Declaration of Independence so that George could sign his name above them all. He was clearly an impressive man, but even all of those accomplishments doesn't even scratch the surface of the type of character he really was, because that wasn't really the thing that impressed me about George. Mind you, a lot of things impressed me. All of those accomplishments cannot be ignored, but I think the thing that spoke to me the most was George's clear stance against slavery and the equal rights of all men. He spoke often against the practice, both publicly and privately, and even issued judgments against slavery during his chancery. Now, mind you, those were unfortunately overturned upon appeal. Now, a lot of you may be sitting there saying, wait a minute, George was a plantation owner. Wouldn't that make him both a slave owner and a hypocrite? Hold your horses, because yes, George owned slaves, but our records show that it's disputed whether or not he bought all of them. Now, some people say that yes, he definitely bought slaves in the past, and therefore they wonder whether or not he had grown these abolitionist ideas towards the later part of his life. But a lot of the slaves he also owned were inherited, and the laws in Virginia regarding inherited slaves and being able to free them later on in your life were difficult. Prior to the Manumission Act of 1782, you actually had to have government approval in order for you to free your slaves. Now, mind you, again, George had married into people with slaves. His wife, Elizabeth, had brought over slaves from their marriage, and upon her death in 1787, most of her slaves that were inherited by George actually ended up going back to her family as per Virginia law, and they would be distributed among her family since they were the ones that bought them. George also had inherited slaves from his family himself, not ones that he had particularly purchased, but they were still technically his. And freeing them all had a lot of issues. So essentially, to boil down what was a very complicated system in emancipating your slaves in Virginia prior to the Civil War was that if you bought them, you got the choice to free them. If you didn't, then you really couldn't. In 1788, George moved to emancipate the remainder of his slaves under his care. Charles, James, Polly, Benjamin, Lydia, and Michael. Not only did he want them to be free, but he also wanted to give them an opportunity to live well. As future biographer John Sanderson would write in his Signers of the Declaration of Independence, he gave them sufficient to free them from want, and his example taught them industrious habits. George respected all of them, but there were two in particular that he cared for especially: Lydia Broadnax and Michael Brown. Lydia, upon her emancipation, actually decided to remain with George and work in his manor as both his chef and maid. And Michael Brown would end up becoming George's student. Like his mother taught him, George taught Michael Latin, Greek, and the rule of law. Now, where George was full of virtue and had a kind heart, his nephew Sweeney did not. Sweeney was known to be a sort of ne'er-do-well and had some bad accounts with some very bad people, and as a result he tried to kind of scam everybody else out of their inheritance. And so he decided the best way was just to kind of kill everyone, and then it would just be left to me, right? Nobody would have to know if we do this right. So he set about his plan by poisoning Lydia, Michael, and George with arsenic, putting it in their food and their drink. Michael ended up dying first, tragically, and George was in pretty bad shape when he suspected his grandnephew of being the one who ended up killing him. So before he passed, he actually struck him from the will, and Lydia, thankfully, was able to survive. George Sweeney was now out of the will and instead found himself indicted on the charge of double homicide, but all of the evidence was circumstantial. Nobody had witnessed him actually poisoning the food or the drink, and so they couldn't actually nail him for the crime that they had accused him of. So he ended up walking. Luckily, a little bit of justice in the fact that he didn't get any of the money, but still kind of awful that he killed both his Michael and George. Luckily, Lydia survived, and I think she would be very happy that we are memorializing George today through a wonderful drink. So let's get into our drink, the President's Lawyer. Now, I wanted to start this off with a pretty traditionally British dessert wine, or at least it's popular, I should say, in England. Because after all, with all the American colonies, we have our British roots, and I think we have to put a little bit of homage to it, even though, you know, we totally rebelled against them. So let's start off with Harvey's. This is the Bristol cream, as it says on their label. This is really, really good. It's actually a combination of 4 sherries, it says. Really tasty, a little combination. Great chilled. This is fantastic chilled. A little syrupy, but it's gonna form a really good base. We're gonna put in 1 ounce of our sherry here. Now, the reason why I'm putting all of this into this tiny little dessert wine glass and why we're making this drink with sherry is because most of what occupied George Whiz's, free time was that he really enjoyed the conversation with his friends. He was a really good friend with the British governor at the time, before the revolution, Governor Falquier. I want to say that's how you pronounce his name. It's Falquier. But he was really good friends with him. He also was good friends with a William Law professor who came over often, and with Thomas Jefferson, who actually lived with them for 5 years. Thomas Jefferson remembers fondly of the conversations they had where they would detail math and philosophy and history and morals, and they would go through this on a consistent basis. So I feel like this drink is perfect for that particular situation. We're going to follow up our sherry with some Blackberry Brandy. Why blackberry? Because blackberries are delicious. It's one of my favorite fruits, and brandy, I feel like, equally goes well with the sherry. It's an after-dinner drink in small portions. It really works well, nice and sweet, kind of boozy. It'll help balance some of the syrupiness that we're getting from the sherry here, and we'll have a really tasty, fruity finish as well. So we're gonna put in, like I said, about a ½ ounce. I'm putting a little bit too much there. There we go. And that's gonna change our color to that beautiful dark red, really nice. And our final 2 ingredients here are both homages to the plantation that George actually owned. He was in charge of a large swath of land, and different crops came in and out, and among them was apple orchards. And as is, apples are delicious. Applejack is a very popular drink back in the 18th century, and in fact, we have Laird's Applejack right here. Now, Laird and Company was started in Monmouth, New Jersey so not too far away from Virginia, but it was really enjoyed by George Washington. And I feel like, for such an iconic Virginian leader like George Washington, plus with the apples, it feels like a right connection for our epic Virginian here in George. So we're going to put in a ½ ounce of Applejack and add that on. So now we have a lot of sweet, boozy ingredients here, all getting to know each other. And in order to cut through that and add a little bit of extra apple flavor, I wanted to throw in some apple blossom bitters. This is Hella Bitters Apple Blossom. It's really good. You get a nice aromatic sense of the apples, but the bitters will cut through all of that sweetness because this is a pretty sweet, boozy drink. But I think this will help balance it out quite well. So about 1 dash. Maybe you're a little bit more accurate than me so you don't spray it everywhere, but it's okay. It's all good. We're just going to mix this up here so that they all combine nice and easily. We're going to take it out, and there you have it, the President's Lure. And, this one really doesn't even need a garnish because it's about the person who's drinking it that is the garnish. Because, after all, when you're sitting there and having fantastic conversations about the big questions of life, the philosophical questions, the mathematical questions, the moral questions, as these men did, I feel like you would have one of these drinks. So let's give it a try. That is just a great nightcap. There, you get the sweetness of the sherry. That's the first thing that you taste, but the bitters of the apple comes almost right afterwards. You get that nice little bitter taste on the back of your tongue. The apple smell comes out, the apple aromatics, I should say, comes out from the bitters as well. Booziness is amped up from the Applejack plus the brandy. I feel like the blackberries really add on to the sweetness of the sherry, so it just makes it even more pronounced. But they work really, really well in tandem. Nothing here is really out of place. This just feels like one well-oiled machine of a nightcap. And this is the type of drink I would imagine that these heavy-hitting thinkers would have as they conversed on spiritual things and also philosophical things. And it's also trying to pay homage, I feel, to all of the founding fathers, as they had a lot to go through in their age, and these little moments gave them a little bit of respite from the hard times that they had surrounded themselves in. And that sounds like Last Call. So one of the things that led me down the path to reading about George Wythe and many of the other founding fathers is a book series that was started by John Sanderson. Now, me and my father had come across this book series a couple years ago, and we heard that many of the schools back in the day actually utilized this book for children to write about some of the founding fathers. It was a connection for them to understand a little bit more about the men who, kind of formed the nation. So John Sanderson, who did this entire biography, it says from 1844 through 1873, so it took him a while, almost 30 years, to compile all the information on the 55 men who signed their death warrants on the Declaration of Independence. It's a tremendous series that has given me a new perspective on a lot of the risks and some of the unknown details of the lives of the founding fathers. We have men like George Wythe, who was an avowed abolitionist towards the end of his life and worked hard towards the emancipation of the slaves. He believed, even so in his own right, that slaves, or at least I should say African Americans, were equal to white men, and he practiced that in his own way by teaching them how to read and teaching them how to write, teaching Michael Brown to become a future lawyer who was tragically taken, because he was murdered by George Wythe Sweeney. Terrible things that happened there, but it's those little details that Sanderson was able to capture and put down in his biography. Now, mind you, the book definitely leans towards the glorification of the American ideal, because obviously it's about our founders and it's written by an American, but it does a great job of being able to shape and show what the founders had to go through and what the impact it was culturally for the nation. I remember reading in here about all of the things leading up to the revolution. Things like the fact that in the state of New York, they had donated a tremendous amount of not only men to their local militias to fight the French and Indian War, but also money. They had donated a lot of money to the British Commissariat in order to be able to fund all of the war as well. So it added to the feeling that there was injustice on behalf of the British by demanding the taxes be paid when they felt that they had already paid the taxes. And it's just little moments like that that I kept finding over and over again with each particular founder. I even have a document where I've just been writing down little quotes, and it's just the kernel of inspiration. This book isn't the end-all be-all of these men's stories. There's a lot more to be found. There's a lot more sources on them, but it's a great start for anyone who really wants to get a new idea of how the founders, went about pretty much declaring their independence, their backstories, and what they had risked for the sake of independence. There's another man who I'm sure I'll talk about later. His name is Thomas Hayward Jr. Even though he was very pro-slavery and had a plantation for his slaves down in South Carolina, he lost his entire estate during the Revolutionary Wars, destroyed by the British. And so he was a man who was equally willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of liberty. And although America's history is checkered, and it's very difficult sometimes to look at because we have our black marks, there is also tremendous valor and sacrifice on behalf of men that we may not always agree with everything they did, but we can't also ignore the good that they did at the same time. We can recognize both the bad and the good and celebrate the good, because that's important for the future of America as well, because this is a great place to live. And if the next generation can be as selfless as this generation, then I'm certain that America will be able to change the world for the better in ways that I think everybody can recognize would be good. Thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to check out any of our other historically inspired cocktails, you can find them here, or you could also find them at topshelfhistory.com, Rumble, Locals, anywhere you find your Top Shelf History stuff. Please give them a check out. If you guys would like to support the channel, you can find that at Locals. Also, please be a part of our community there. You can find all of our stuff at locals.com, including all of today's video and our previous videos as well. That'll be our main interactive website in terms of really fostering our community, so please consider checking it out. But from all of us here at Top Shelf History, remember, history is better with a drink. Cheers.